2 days after they arrived, I was standing on my creaky porch, watching my beautiful beach house, the place I had cherished for decades, become nothing more than a playground for strangers who treated it like a hotel, not a home. The memories of laughter, sunrises over Long Island Sound, and my late husband's faint scent in the breeze seemed to drown under the weight of indifference and whispered complaints. My heart was breaking in silence, and nobody seemed to notice. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Edna, I'm 72 years old, and I've been living alone in our modest New York apartment for 3 years now, always longing for that house by the shore, the one I'd bought with my husband Harold before he passed, the one our son Michael and his wife Susan always promised to respect. But that summer, everything changed. It began with what seemed like an innocent phone call on a Tuesday morning in June. I remember because I was watering my small balcony garden, thinking about Harold's tomatoes that he used to grow in those same pots. Michael's voice was effortless and light when he called. "Mom, Susan's parents are coming for a few days to the beach house. I hope that's okay." Just like that. Casual. As if he was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "A few days," he said. Those 3 words echoed in my mind as I smiled into the phone, imagining new faces around our old dining table, maybe sharing stories about their grandchildren, perhaps helping me with the garden that Harold and I had planted together 40 years ago. I unpacked an imaginary guest welcome basket in my mind. Fresh towels. Maybe I'd drive out there myself to stock the refrigerator with their favorite foods. I pictured myself showing Susan's mother the photo albums on the shelf, the ones filled with Michael's childhood summers, building sandcastles, learning to swim in those gentle waves. I was genuinely excited. After Harold passed, that house had felt too quiet, too empty. The thought of voices filling those rooms again made my heart flutter with something I hadn't felt in months: purpose. But reality, my dear friends, reality was brutal. Those few days stretched into a week. Then 2 weeks. Then a month. The silences in the house grew heavier than the salty air surrounding it. When I called to check on things, Susan's father answered with short, clipped responses. "Everything's fine, Edith." He never got my name right. When I gently corrected him, he'd grunt and hand the phone to Susan's mother, who spoke to me like I was a hotel manager checking on difficult guests. The smell of their foreign spices simmering in my kitchen clashed with the lingering scent of Harold's pipe tobacco that still lived in the curtains. The hardwood floors that Harold had installed himself, board by board, now bore muddy footprints where I had prayed for respect. Sand tracked through the living room, wet towels left on my antique furniture, Harold's favorite reading chair moved to face the television instead of the window where he used to watch the sunrise. I touched the photographs of our family lining the walls during my weekly drive to check on the house. Their glass frames reflected my helplessness back at me. In one photo, Michael is 8 years old, gap-toothed and sun-kissed, holding up a shell he'd found for me. "Look, Mama, it's perfect," he'd said. Harold's arm was wrapped around my waist, his other hand ruffling Michael's sandy hair. We looked so happy. So complete. So permanent. Now, standing in that same spot 35 years later, I felt invisible. Why was I invisible in my own life? How had I become a shadow in the very house where I'd raised my son, where I'd nursed Harold through his illness, where I'd scattered some of his ashes in the garden he loved? But let me tell you about the years that led to this moment. Let me tell you about the woman who always said yes, who always gave, who always believed that love meant sacrifice. Maybe you'll recognize her. Maybe you are her. I remember the years I gave without question. After Harold died and the empty nest syndrome hit like a tidal wave, I threw myself into being the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother. Long nights spent knitting scarves for their children, little Emma and sweet Joey. My fingers would cramp from the repetitive motions, but I'd push through because I imagined their faces lighting up when they unwrapped my gifts. The emergency loans started small. A phone call here, a whispered conversation there. "Mom, it's just temporary," Michael would say, his voice carrying that same boyish vulnerability I remembered from when he'd broken his bicycle or lost his baseball glove. "We'll pay you back as soon as Susan gets that promotion. You know how much we appreciate everything you do for us." I gave my savings, bit by bit. The security of my retirement, the money Harold had worked double shifts to accumulate, slowly drained away to keep their dreams afloat. When the bank called Michael with those cheap, threatening tones about missed mortgage payments, somehow the solution always involved my checkbook. When Emma needed braces, when Joey wanted to join the soccer team, when their car broke down, every crisis became my financial responsibility. I said yes to every phone call, every favor, every late-night emergency. "Mom, could you drive down and watch the kids? Susan has that work conference." "Mom, could you lend us money for groceries this week?" "Mom, could you take Joey to his doctor's appointment? We're both swamped." I became the invisible glue that held their broken weekends and messy schedules together. Christmas mornings spent at their house, cooking their meals while they slept in. Easter dinners where I brought all the food, set the table, cleaned the dishes, and drove home alone while they settled in to watch movies. Susan called one Christmas Eve, her voice tight with that familiar desperation that always preceded a request. "Mom, could you watch the kids? We have a last-minute opportunity to go to that resort in the Hamptons. You know, the one Susan's been wanting to try. It's just for 3 days." Of course, I said yes. I always said yes. I canceled my plans to visit Rosa, my downstairs neighbor who'd become like a sister to me. Instead, I spent Christmas Day entertaining 2 cranky children while their parents posted photos from their romantic getaway on social media. Pictures of champagne glasses and sunset dinners while I was wiping runny noses and reading bedtime stories to kids who kept asking when mommy and daddy were coming home. But then there were those thin silences that started creeping in. Silences that felt different from the comfortable quiet Harold and I used to share. When I called to check on Michael, I'd hear muted voices in the background, hurried whispers before he'd come to the phone with a distant, "Hey, Mom." Those conversations became shorter, more perfunctory. "I'm busy" became his favorite phrase when I mentioned my arthritis flaring up or the box of his favorite chocolate chip cookies I'd baked as a surprise. One evening in February, after I'd had a particularly bad day at the doctor's office, my blood pressure was spiking, and I was scared. I called Michael just to hear his voice. Just to feel connected to someone. The conversation started normally enough, but when I mentioned feeling dizzy and alone, something shifted in his tone. "Mom, stop guilt-tripping us," he snapped. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Every time we talk, you have some crisis, some problem that somehow becomes our responsibility. Susan and I have our own lives, our own stress. We can't be your emotional support system." The cold silence that followed felt like someone had stepped directly on my heart with steel-toed boots. I hung up the phone and stared at it for 20 minutes, wondering when caring about my own health and wanting to share it with my son had become manipulation. When had expressing my fears become guilt-tripping? For the first time in my 72 years, I started to wonder, was I being used? Was love here always transactional? Had I confused being needed with being loved? The signs had been there for months, maybe years. The way Susan would smile politely when I arrived but never make eye contact. The way my grandchildren hugged me like I was a distant relative instead of the grandmother who'd rocked them to sleep countless nights. The way Michael's voice changed when he answered my calls, going from warm and natural when he thought I was someone else, to forced and dutiful when he realized it was me. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever wondered if the people you love most are only kind to you when they need something? Birthdays began vanishing without a card or a call. My 71st birthday passed completely unacknowledged. I spent the day waiting by the phone, checking my mailbox 3 times, even looking at my computer to see if maybe there was an email I'd missed. Nothing. When I finally called Michael 2 days later, he said, "Oh God, Mom, was that this week? Things have been so crazy here." Crazy. Their lives were always crazy, always more important than remembering the woman who'd given birth to him, who'd sat up all night when he had pneumonia at age 6, who'd driven him to every baseball practice and school play and college visit. When I got sick that autumn, really sick, not just the usual aches and pains, the doctor insisted I needed rest and someone to check on me regularly. My chest would tighten without warning, and I'd find myself gasping for breath in the middle of simple tasks like folding laundry or making tea. The cardiologist used words like stress and anxiety and dangerous spikes that terrified me. But Michael missed the appointments I'd asked him to attend. Susan was always conveniently busy when I needed a ride to follow-up visits. When I mentioned how scared I was, how the nights felt endless and frightening when I couldn't catch my breath, Michael dismissed it as old age blues. "Mom, you're fine. You've always been dramatic about health stuff. Remember when you thought that mole was cancer? It was nothing." But Harold had taken every one of my concerns seriously. Harold had held my hand in doctors' waiting rooms and asked the questions I was too intimidated to ask. Harold had understood that being afraid didn't make me weak, it made me human. Then came the betrayal that shattered whatever illusions I'd been clinging to. It was a rainy Thursday in October. Michael had borrowed my laptop because his was acting up, and he'd left it on my kitchen table when he rushed out to pick up Emma from school. I wasn't snooping, I just wanted to check my email and see if Rosa had sent me the meatball recipe she'd promised. The laptop was still logged into Michael's email account. There, in black and white, was the rental agreement they'd signed just the month before. A lease agreement to rent out my beach house, as a vacation property during the summer months. They'd researched rental rates, calculated profits, even set up a business bank account to collect the money. The beach house Harold and I had saved for, had dreamed about, had poured our hearts into renovating, was being treated like a commodity. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the email chain between Michael and Susan, discussing how to handle Mom when she found out. Susan had written, "Just tell her it's temporary and we need the money. She always falls for the guilt trip. She basically owes us anyway for all the times we've had to deal with her drama." Michael's response, "Yeah, she'll get over it. She always does. Besides, it's not like she uses the house anymore since Dad died. She's just being sentimental." Sentimental. 40 years of memories reduced to sentimentality. I printed those emails with shaking hands. The paper felt heavy, heavier than it should have, weighted with the truth I'd been trying not to see. I crumpled the pages, then smoothed them out, then crumpled them again. My favorite teacup, the one Harold had bought me for our 20th anniversary, painted with tiny roses, slipped from my trembling hands and shattered against the cold tile floor. The sound echoed through my empty apartment like a gunshot. I knelt there among the pieces, tears blurring the photo on the side table, the three of us in front of the beach house, Michael about 12 years old, all of us tan and happy and completely unaware that one day he'd commodify the very place where the picture was taken. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of neglect and lies, gasping for air in a relationship that had become as toxic as it was necessary. The crying came in waves, not the gentle tears of missing Harold, but the harsh, body-shaking sobs of a woman who'd finally seen herself clearly. I wasn't a beloved mother being cared for by grateful children. I was a resource being managed by people who'd learned to take my love for granted. For the first time in my adult life, I thought I could say no. The words felt foreign in my mouth, dangerous and thrilling like a teenager's first curse word. But the fear of loneliness clawed at me immediately, whispering its familiar threats. What if this is all you have left, Edna? What if saying no means having nobody? What if being used is better than being forgotten completely? Yet beneath the fear, something else was burning, a flame I hadn't felt in years. The need for respect. The demand for dignity. The voice that Harold used to nurture in me, the one that said I deserved better than scraps of affection thrown my way when convenient. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I packed away the framed photographs of Michael, Susan, and the grandchildren from the mantel and put them in the bedroom closet. Not thrown away, I wasn't ready for that level of finality, but removed from the place of honor they'd occupied in my living room. Their smiles now felt like mockery in the silent house, fake expressions frozen in time from back when I'd still believed in the authenticity of our relationships. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror that night, studying the face looking back at me. 72 years old. Gray hair that I'd stopped coloring because Susan once said it looked desperate. Worry lines carved deep around my eyes from years of anxiety about everyone's problems but my own. When had I become so small? When had I learned to fold myself into whatever shape others needed me to be? The woman in the mirror was a stranger, fragile and furious, heartbroken and surprisingly determined. She looked like someone who might finally be ready to fight for herself. But fighting meant confronting the people I loved most in the world. Fighting meant risking the relationships that, damaged as they were, still formed the framework of my daily existence. Fighting meant admitting that I'd been complicit in my own diminishment for years. Are you thinking what I was thinking? Are you wondering how someone gets to be 72 years old and still learning to advocate for herself? The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't planned. It erupted on a Sunday morning in late October when Michael showed up unannounced with Susan and the kids, expecting me to make pancakes and watch football while they napped on my couch. It was the same routine we'd fallen into over the past year, them arriving when convenient, me dropping everything to accommodate them, everyone pretending this was how families were supposed to work. But this time, when Michael walked into my kitchen and started opening cabinets like he owned the place, something inside me snapped. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Michael barely looked up from where he was searching for the good syrup. "Can it wait, Mom? We've got plans this afternoon, and the kids are hungry." "No," I said. Just that one word. "It cannot wait." Susan appeared in the doorway, Emma and Joey trailing behind her like suspicious ducklings. "What's wrong, Mom?" Susan asked, but her tone suggested I was the inconvenience they'd have to manage before getting to the important parts of their day. I laid the printed emails on the kitchen table. The silence that followed was devastating. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, defensiveness, and finally anger. Susan's mouth fell open, but she recovered quickly, crossing her arms and lifting her chin like a boxer preparing for a fight. "You went through my private emails?" Michael demanded. "You left your computer open in my home," I replied. "But that's not the point, is it? The point is that you've been planning to rent out my house without telling me. The point is that you think I'm stupid enough to fall for your guilt trips. The point is that you see my fears and my needs as drama that you have to endure." "Mom, you're overreacting," Michael said, his eyes darting away from mine the way they used to when he was caught in a lie as a child. "We were going to tell you." We just wanted to work out the details first. But Susan wasn't interested in his diplomatic approach. Her voice was sharp as broken glass when she spoke. You don't get to decide how we handle our financial situation, Edna. That house is just sitting there empty while we're struggling. We have real responsibilities, real bills, real children to support. It's my house, I said quietly. It's a house, Susan corrected. It's an asset that's doing nothing but collecting dust and property taxes while your son can't afford to take his children on vacation. Emma began to cry. Joey stepped closer to his mother, his small face confused and frightened. These poor children, caught in the middle of an adult conflict they couldn't understand. But I'd spent too many years protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own truth. It's the house where I nursed your husband through chicken pox and broken hearts, I said, looking directly at Susan. It's where I taught your children to swim and build sandcastles. It's where my husband and I planned to grow old together before cancer stole that dream. It's where I go to feel close to him, to remember who we were as a family. It's not just an asset, Susan. It's my life. Michael stepped between us, his jaw clenched in frustrated anger. Mom, you're being selfish. You're thinking about dead memories instead of living people with real needs. Susan's right, we're struggling. The mortgage, the kids' activities, our medical bills. You could help us, but instead you're clinging to empty rooms and old photographs. Dead memories? I repeated. The words felt like acid in my mouth. Is that what your childhood is to you? Dead memories? That's not what I meant, and you know it, Michael snapped. Stop twisting my words. You're pushing us away with this possessive behavior. It's not healthy, Mom. Maybe you should think about your heart condition and whether this kind of stress is good for you. There it was. The threat disguised as concern. The suggestion that my anger was a medical symptom rather than a justified response to betrayal. How many times had my emotions been pathologized, dismissed as hormones or age or illness instead of legitimate reactions to legitimate problems? My granddaughter Emma was still crying, her small voice cutting through the angry words. Why is everyone yelling? Grandma, are you okay? I knelt down to Emma's level, this sweet child who'd inherited my green eyes and Harold's stubborn chin. I'm okay, sweetheart. Sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations about important things. But I love you, and that will never change. Joey, always my serious little philosopher, studied my face with 8-year-old intensity. Grandma, are you going to stop letting us come to the beach house? How do you explain to a child that his parents have been lying to everyone? How do you tell him that the adults he trusts most have been treating their grandmother like a convenient resource rather than a person deserving of respect? The beach house will always be a place where you're welcome, Joey, I said carefully. But things might need to change in how we arrange visits. Susan's sharp voice cut across my words. Don't make promises you can't keep, Edna. If you're going to be inflexible about this, maybe the kids shouldn't come at all. Maybe it's better if we just find our own place for family vacations. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Choose our way or lose access to your grandchildren. Submit to our planning or be cut off from the relationships that matter most to you. It was emotional blackmail dressed up as practical necessity. But then something unexpected happened. A soft knock at my door interrupted the electric tension in the room. Rosa's voice called through the door, Edna? I heard voices. Is everything all right? Rosa Martinez had moved into the apartment below mine 2 years ago, a retired nurse whose husband had passed the same year as Harold. We'd bonded over our shared experience of sudden solitude, our mutual struggle to rediscover who we were without our partners, our careful navigation of adult children who loved us but didn't quite know what to do with us. Come in, Rosa, I called. The door's open. Rosa appeared in my doorway wearing her favorite purple cardigan and carrying a plate of her famous empanadas. She must have been planning to surprise me with lunch. Her intelligent dark eyes took in the scene quickly, the printed emails on the table, the tears on Emma's face, the rigid anger radiating from Susan, the defeated slump of Michael's shoulders. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't realize you had company. I'll come back later. But Emma broke away from Susan and ran to Rosa, wrapping her small arms around Rosa's waist. Tia Rosa, she said. She'd started calling Rosa Aunt months ago, delighting my neighbor who'd never had children of her own. Everyone's fighting. Mama and Daddy are mad at Grandma. Rosa set down her empanadas and smoothed Emma's hair with gentle fingers. Her presence immediately changed the emotional temperature of the room. Here was someone who showed genuine affection for my grandchildren without agenda, who remembered their birthdays without being reminded, who listened to their stories with patience and interest. Sometimes people disagree about important things, Rosa told Emma. But your grandmother loves you very much, and so do your parents. Sometimes grown-ups need to work through problems, just like you and Joey do when you argue about toys. Susan's expression tightened as she watched Emma cling to Rosa. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the uncomfortable realization that their children had formed a genuine attachment to this woman who owed them nothing but gave them unconditional warmth. Michael cleared his throat. "We should probably go," he said. "Let everyone calm down before we continue this conversation." But Rosa's steady presence had given me strength I didn't know I possessed. "Actually," I said, "I think we should finish this conversation now. I think we should be clear about where everyone stands." Rosa squeezed Emma's hand and said, "Why don't you and Joey come downstairs with me? I have a new puzzle I've been saving, and I think I have some juice boxes in my refrigerator." The children left eagerly, their departure removing the buffer that had been forcing everyone to moderate their language and volume. Once their footsteps faded down the hallway, Susan let her mask slip completely. "I'm tired of tiptoeing around your feelings, Edna," she said. "You gave us permission to use the beach house whenever we wanted. You said it was sitting empty and we should take advantage of it. Now you're acting like we betrayed you by actually taking you up on the offer." "I gave you permission to use it," I agreed. "I didn't give you permission to turn it into a business." "What's the difference?" Susan demanded. "We're using it, other people are using it, it's getting used instead of sitting empty." "The difference is honesty," I said. "The difference is respect. The difference is acknowledging that it belongs to me, that it has emotional significance to me, that decisions about it should involve me." Michael rubbed his temples like he was fighting a headache. "Mom, we needed the money. You know we've been struggling. We thought you'd understand." "I would have understood if you'd asked me," I said. "I would have been happy to help you figure out a solution if you'd been honest about your financial problems instead of sneaking around behind my back." "You would have said no," Susan accused. "You would have gotten all emotional about Dad's memory and made us feel guilty for needing help." "You don't know that," I replied. "You never gave me the chance to prove you wrong. You just assumed I'd be unreasonable and decided to handle me instead of talking to me." The weight of their dismissal was suffocating. Every word confirmed what those emails had revealed. They saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected. My opinions didn't matter. My feelings didn't count. My ownership of my own property was inconvenient to their plans. But in Rosa's company, even for just those few minutes, a fragile seed of hope had taken root. Here was proof that genuine affection still existed in the world, that relationships could be mutual and respectful, that I wasn't crazy to expect better treatment from the people who claimed to love me. Have you ever felt that moment of clarity? When you realize that the problem isn't your expectations being too high, but their behavior being unacceptably low? That night, after Michael and Susan left with barely civil goodbyes, Rosa came back upstairs with Emma and Joey. The children had calmed down and were full of stories about Rosa's puzzle collection and her photo albums from her nursing days. They seemed more relaxed than they'd been in months, their laughter genuine and unstressed. "Your grandmother loves you both very much," Rosa told them as they got ready to leave. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions, but that doesn't change how much we care about you." After everyone was gone, Rosa helped me clean up the kitchen and listened while I explained the whole situation. She didn't offer advice or try to fix anything. She just listened, her presence a reminder that I deserved to be heard, deserved to have my feelings treated as valid. "You know what I think, Mija," she said finally, using the pet name that never failed to warm my heart. "I think you've been so busy taking care of everyone else that you forgot to take care of yourself. And now they're all confused because they don't know how to function without you carrying the weight for everyone." That night, I'd done something I hadn't done in years. I called a legal aid clinic that specialized in elder rights. Rosa had given me the number, she'd volunteered there before she retired and knew they offered free consultations for seniors dealing with financial exploitation. The lawyer I spoke with, a kind young woman named Jennifer, listened to my story and asked careful questions about the beach house ownership, the loans I'd made to Michael and Susan, and their unauthorized use of my property for profit. "Mrs. Patterson," Jennifer said, "what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. Your son may not realize the legal implications of what he's doing, but taking control of your assets without permission and profiting from your property without your consent are serious matters." Financial elder abuse. The phrase hit me like cold water. I'd been thinking of it as family drama, as hurt feelings and misunderstandings. But there were laws about what my children had done, legal consequences for treating elderly parents like sources of money rather than people with rights. "What are my options?" I asked. "Several," Jennifer replied. "We can help you document everything, establish clear boundaries around your assets, and if necessary, pursue legal remedies. But the first step is often simply asserting your rights clearly and unambiguously. Many cases resolve once adult children understand that their behavior has legal consequences." I scheduled an appointment for the following week. For the first time in months, I felt like I had an ally, someone on my side who understood that my desire for respect wasn't unreasonable. It was Rosa who drove me to that appointment, her small hand steady on the steering wheel, her gentle questions helping me organize my thoughts. Together, we spent 3 hours with Jennifer, reviewing documents, making copies of the emails, documenting the loans and the unauthorized rental agreement. "You have excellent records," Jennifer told me. "Your husband trained you well. These documents will be very helpful if we need to take formal action." Harold had indeed trained me well. 45 years of marriage to a man who respected my intelligence had taught me to keep careful track of finances, to read legal documents thoroughly, to ask questions when things didn't make sense. It was Harold's influence that had made me print those emails instead of just deleting them in anger. When we met with Jennifer, she helped me open a new bank account that only I controlled. The old accounts, the ones Michael had access to for emergencies, were closed. The steady drain of my savings stopped immediately. It felt like taking my first real breath in years. "Now," Jennifer said, "you need to decide how you want to handle the beach house situation. You have several options, but they all require you to be very clear about your boundaries." That evening, Rosa and I sat on my small balcony overlooking the courtyard behind our building. The autumn air was crisp, and she'd brought a thermos of her famous hot chocolate. We watched the sunset paint the brick walls golden, and I found myself thinking about Harold, wondering what he would advise me to do. "He would tell you to fight," Rosa said, as if she were reading my mind. "Harold loved you too much to want you treated this way." She was right. Harold had always been my advocate, the person who saw my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. When I doubted my intelligence, he reminded me that I'd run our household finances for decades without a single mistake. When I worried that I wasn't interesting enough for his friends, he'd list all the books I'd read, the places we'd traveled, the conversations we'd shared. Harold had seen me as a complete person worthy of respect and love. What would he think of the woman I'd become? The woman who accepted crumbs of affection from her own children, who apologized for having needs, who allowed herself to be treated like a convenient resource. "I think it's time to stop being convenient," I told Rosa. She smiled and raised her mug of hot chocolate. "To inconvenient women," she said. "To inconvenient women," I agreed. The next morning, I did something that would have terrified me 6 months earlier. I called Michael and told him we were having a family meeting. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A statement of fact. "I'm setting up a video call for tomorrow evening at 7, I said. "I expect you, Susan, and her parents to be there. We need to discuss the beach house situation and establish some new ground rules." "Mom, we don't need her parents involved in our family business," Michael protested. "They became involved the moment they started profiting from my property," I replied. "If they're going to use my house, they're going to hear my terms directly." Susan tried a different approach when she called later that day. "Edna, I think we can work this out just between us. No need to make it all formal and weird." But I'd learned something important from Jennifer. People who want to exploit you will always prefer informal arrangements, handshake deals, and family understanding over clear contracts and explicit boundaries. Formality protects the vulnerable. Weirdness was my friend now. When 7 o'clock arrived the next evening, I was ready. Rosa sat beside me at my kitchen table, not to speak for me but to remind me that I wasn't alone. On my laptop screen, I could see Michael and Susan in their living room, her parents visible in the background looking uncomfortable and annoyed. I held up a photograph, an old one of Harold and me standing in front of the beach house the day we'd closed on it. We were so young, so hopeful, so completely unaware of everything that lay ahead. "This house," I said, "represents the dreams and sacrifice of two people who loved each other for 45 years. It's where we plan to retire together, where we hope to welcome grandchildren, where Harold spent his last healthy summer teaching his grandson to fish." I tore the photograph in half. The sound was sharp and final. "That dream is gone," I continued. "Harold is gone. But the house remains, and it belongs to me. Not to Michael and Susan's financial portfolio. Not to her parents' vacation plans. To me." Susan's mother leaned forward into the camera range. "Now just a minute, Edna. We've been very respectful of your property. We've done nothing but appreciate the opportunity you gave us." "The opportunity one gave you was to visit," I replied. "Not to turn my home into a business. Not to calculate rental income from my property. Not to make plans for my asset without my involvement." I pulled out a folder Jennifer had helped me prepare. "These are my new terms. The beach house will continue to be available for family use, but with clear boundaries. All visits must be scheduled with me in advance. No subletting, no rental agreements, no business use without my explicit written consent. Anyone who violates these terms will lose access permanently." Michael's face was flushed red. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. We're trying to include you in our decisions." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in years. "You're trying to manage me while you make decisions without me. There's a difference." Susan leaned forward, her expression calculating. What if we're willing to pay you rent for the times we use it? Would that make you feel more part of the arrangement? I don't want your money, I said. I want your respect. I will no longer buy love, and I will no longer accept being treated as a convenient resource. You can respect me and my ownership, or you can lose access to what I own. The silence that followed was electric. Rosa's hand found mine under the table, her gentle squeeze reminding me to breathe. Susan's father finally spoke up. This seems like a family matter. Margie and I can find other accommodations. That would be appreciated, I said. Michael tried one last appeal to emotion. Mom, think about the kids. Think about all the memories we could make. Don't let hurt feelings destroy family traditions. I am thinking about the kids, I replied. I'm thinking about what kind of adults they'll become if they learn that promises don't matter, that other people's property is theirs to use, that elderly relatives exist to be exploited. I'm thinking about what I'm teaching them by allowing myself to be disrespected. Susan's mask fell away completely. Fine. If you want to be the controlling, bitter old woman, that's your choice. But don't expect us to pretend everything's normal when you're acting like this. I don't expect anything anymore, I said quietly. That's the problem. I've spent 3 years expecting love and receiving management. I've spent 3 years expecting respect and receiving manipulation. I'm done expecting. From now on, I'm requiring. I ended the video call, the screen going black on their stunned faces. Rosa squeezed my hand. How do you feel? For the first time in months, I could answer honestly. Free. But freedom, I was about to learn, comes with a price. The next few weeks brought a campaign of emotional manipulation that would have broken the woman I'd been 6 months earlier. Michael called daily, alternating between anger and wounded confusion. Mom, I don't understand what's gotten into you. This isn't like you. He was right. It wasn't like me. The old me would have already apologized, would have found a way to blame myself for their behavior, would have restored their access to my house and my bank account in exchange for peace. Susan tried a different approach, sending Emma and Joey to the phone to tell me how sad they were that they couldn't go to the beach house anymore. Grandma, Daddy says you don't want us to visit, Emma said, her small voice breaking my heart. That's not true, sweetheart, I told her. I want you to visit very much. But visits need to be planned so everyone knows what to expect. Why is everything so complicated now? Joey asked. It used to be simple. Out of the mouths of babes. It used to be simple because I absorbed all the complexity, handled all the complications, smoothed all the rough edges. Now that I was expecting them to participate in planning and respect my boundaries, suddenly things felt complicated. But the campaign that hurt the most came from Susan's parents. They sent a letter, an actual physical letter, as if the formality would give their words more weight. In it, they expressed how disappointed they were in my selfishness, how they'd always thought I was a more generous person, how sorry they felt for Michael having to deal with such difficult behavior from his own mother. That letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when I was already feeling fragile. I'd woken up missing Harold with particular intensity, the way grief sometimes hits without warning, and reading their criticism felt like being kicked while I was already down. I called Rosa, crying before she'd even said hello. They're right, I sobbed. I'm being selfish. I'm being difficult. Maybe I should just give them what they want and try to be grateful for whatever scraps of affection they throw my way. Mija, Rosa said gently, you're being human. You're asking for the same respect they give to strangers, to their friends, to people they want something from. Why should your own family be the only people allowed to treat you badly? But doubt crept in anyway. Late at night, I'd lie awake wondering if I was overreacting, if I was letting my grief over Harold cloud my judgment, if my need for respect was actually just selfishness in disguise. It was Jennifer from the legal aid clinic who helped me regain perspective. During our follow-up appointment, she showed me statistics about financial elder abuse, stories from other clients who'd been confused and gaslit into doubting their own experiences. Mrs. Patterson, she said, everything you're experiencing right now is textbook emotional manipulation. They're trying to exhaust your resolve, to make standing up for yourself feel like more trouble than it's worth. The question is, are you going to let them succeed? 3 weeks after our family video conference, I made a decision that would test my newfound boundaries in ways I never anticipated. I drove out to the beach house. I hadn't been there since the summer, hadn't seen the condition they'd left it in after their extended occupancy. The drive along the Long Island Sound was beautiful as always, golden October light making the water sparkle, the trees beginning their autumn transformation. Harold and I had made this drive hundreds of times, his hand resting on mine as I navigated the winding coastal roads. But when I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. The house looked tired. The flower boxes Harold had installed under the windows were dead and brown. Beer bottles and cigarette butts littered the deck we'd stained and sealed every spring for 20 years. The outdoor furniture was stained and turned over, as if someone had had a party and never cleaned up. Inside was worse. The hardwood floors Harold had refinished himself 3 times over the decades were scratched and water damaged. Red wine stains darkened the upholstery of the couch where Harold used to read his morning papers. The kitchen sink was full of dishes that had been sitting so long they'd developed a film of mold. But the worst discovery was in Harold's study. His desk drawers had been rifled through. His collection of first edition books, his pride and joy, the volumes he'd collected over 40 years of patient searching in used bookstores, were gone. In their place was a note in Michael's handwriting: "Mom, took Dad's books to be appraised. Some of them might be worth money. We'll let you know what we find out." I sat in Harold's empty chair and cried. Not the gentle tears of missing him, but the harsh, angry tears of a woman whose final sanctuary had been violated. Harold's books weren't just valuable objects to be appraised and sold. They were the physical representation of his mind, his curiosity, his lifelong love of learning. They were supposed to stay in this room, on these shelves, waiting for grandchildren to discover them the way Harold had always hoped. I called Michael from the study, surrounded by the empty shelves. "Where are Harold's books?" I asked without preamble. Silence. Then, "Mom, what are you doing at the house? You said we needed to schedule visits." "I'm at my house," I corrected, "looking at the damage you've done." "Where are your father's books?" "We took them to be appraised. Some of those old books might be worth something, and you could use the money for maintenance on the house. We were thinking of you. You had no right to remove anything from this house without my permission," I said. "Mom, they're just books. Dad's been gone for 3 years. It's not like he's coming back to read them. Just books." 40 years of Harold's intellectual passion reduced to inventory for a potential sale. "I want them back," I said. "All of them. Today." "That's not practical. We'd have to drive out there, and we have plans tonight. Besides, the appraiser needs time to evaluate them properly." "Michael," I said, my voice deadly quiet, "if those books are not back on these shelves by tomorrow evening, I'm calling the police to report a theft." "You wouldn't call the police on your own son," Michael said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Try me." I hung up and immediately called Jennifer. Within an hour, I had documented everything: photographs of the damaged house, the missing books, the evidence of unauthorized occupancy. Jennifer assured me that I had grounds for several legal actions, from trespassing to theft to property damage. But more importantly, she helped me understand that I was past the point of trying to preserve relationships that had never been authentic. People who truly loved me wouldn't steal from me, wouldn't damage my property, wouldn't dismiss my emotional attachment to my late husband's possessions as sentimentality. That night, I stayed at the beach house for the first time since Harold died. I cleaned what I could, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and sat on the deck watching the sunset over the sound. The peace I felt was complicated, tinged with sadness for Harold's absence and anger at the betrayal, but underneath it all was something I hadn't felt in years: the sense that this place belonged to me, that I had the right to protect it, that I was worthy of that protection. Rosa drove out the next morning with supplies and reinforcements, a bottle of wine, fresh sheets for the bed, and her famous empanadas. Together, we worked to restore some order to the house, and for the first time I could remember, I felt like I had an ally who understood the importance of this place not as an asset but as a home. At exactly 5 o'clock, Michael's car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as he and Susan unloaded box after box of Harold's books from their trunk. Their movements were sharp with anger, their faces set in the expression of people being forced to do something against their will. They didn't knock on the door or announce themselves, they simply carried the boxes to the deck and left them there like a delivery service. I let them finish before I opened the door. "Thank you for returning Harold's books," I said formally. Susan turned on me with fury I'd never seen from her before. "Are you happy now? Are you satisfied with forcing your own family to drive 2 hours to return property that we were trying to help you manage?" "I'm satisfied with having my husband's books back where they belong," I replied. Michael stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. "Mom, this has gone too far. You're treating us like criminals for trying to help you. Do you realize how this looks? Do you understand what you're doing to our family?" "I understand that you took property that didn't belong to you without asking," I said. "I understand that you damaged my house while using it for profit. I understand that when I asked for respect, you respond with anger and manipulation. We're your family," Susan shouted. "We're trying to help you deal with all of this stuff you can't possibly need or use." "You're not trying to help me," I said quietly. "You're trying to help yourselves to what's mine. There's a difference." As they drove away, tires spinning on the gravel driveway, I felt the weight of finality settling over the relationship. This wasn't a temporary disagreement that would blow over with time. This was a fundamental incompatibility between people who saw me as a person deserving respect and people who saw me as a resource to be managed. That night, Rosa and I sat on the deck with glasses of wine, watching the stars appear over Long Island Sound. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of salt water and changing leaves. Do you regret it? Rosa asked softly. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret standing up for myself, even though it meant losing the illusion of a loving family relationship? I regret that it was necessary, I said finally. I regret that they made it necessary. But I don't regret doing it. But even as I spoke those words, I knew the hardest test was still coming. 2 weeks later, it arrived in my mailbox like a bomb disguised as correspondence. It was a social media printout that someone, I suspect Susan's sister, had mailed to me anonymously. Pages and pages of Facebook posts from Susan's mother, bragging about their amazing vacation oasis thanks to my generous in-laws, and the perfect family retreat that we've been blessed to enjoy all summer. The photos showed everything. Susan's parents hosting parties on my deck, strangers swimming in the Sound from my private beach access, groups of people I'd never seen before toasting with champagne in Harold's study. My house had become a backdrop for their social media performance of success and privilege. But the caption that broke my heart was on a photo of Emma and Joey building sandcastles, so grateful for this beautiful space where our grandchildren can make magical memories with their extended family. Extended family. As if I were some distant relation rather than the grandmother who'd rocked those children to sleep, who'd taught them to swim in those same waters, who'd built those same sandcastles with them countless times before their parents decided I was expendable. The worst part was the comments section. Friends and relatives writing things like, "You're so lucky to have such generous family," and "What a beautiful place. Your in-laws must really love you." The narrative being created in these posts was that Susan's parents were beloved family members being generously hosted by grateful relatives, not opportunistic strangers who'd exploited my kindness and trust. I sat in my kitchen staring at those photos for an hour, feeling waves of anger and humiliation wash over me. They'd not only used my property without permission, they'd turned it into a public performance of their own generosity and family values. My betrayal had become their social media content. My first instinct was to call Michael, to scream at him, to demand explanations and apologies. My second instinct was to post my own response, to tell the true story behind those smiling photographs. But Rosa's gentle wisdom stopped me. "Mija," she said when I called her, shaking with rage, "responding to their performance with your own performance won't give you what you need." What do you need? What did I need? I needed them to understand that their actions had consequences. I needed them to acknowledge that they'd hurt me. I needed them to see me as a person worthy of basic respect. But I was beginning to understand that those needs would never be met by people who were fundamentally incapable of meeting them. People who could exploit my trust and then celebrate their exploitat through social media posts weren't people who could be reasoned with or educated or reformed. The next morning, Michael called with what I suppose he thought was an olive branch. "Mom," he said, his voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and conciliatory, "Susan and I have been talking. We realize this whole situation got out of hand. We want to apologize for not communicating better about our plans for the beach house." Notice what he apologized for: not communicating. Not lying, not stealing, not exploiting, just not communicating better. As if the problem was a simple misunderstanding rather than a fundamental violation of trust and respect. "We were thinking," he continued, "maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement where everyone's needs get met. You want to feel included in decisions about the house, and we need help with our financial situation. What if we set up a formal agreement where you rent the house to us for family use, and we pay you fair market rate?" There it was. The offer that was supposed to make everything better. Give them what they wanted, control of my property, and they'd pay me for the privilege. As if my objection had been financial rather than emotional, as if my pain could be solved with a rental agreement. "You want to rent my house from me," I said. "We want to find a solution that works for everyone," Michael replied. "This way you get income from the property, we get the stability of knowing we can plan family trips, and the kids get to keep their connection to the beach house." "And where do I fit in this arrangement?" I asked. "When do I get to use my own house?" "Well, obviously you'd have access whenever you wanted. We'd just coordinate schedules to make sure we're not there at the same time, to avoid any awkwardness." Avoid awkwardness. They wanted to rent my house and exclude me from it simultaneously. They wanted the legal right to my property without the inconvenience of my presence. "Michael," I said, "I'm going to say something to you that I should have said months ago." "No. Mom, don't make a decision when you're upset. Think about it logically. This could solve all our problems." "It would solve your problems," I corrected. "It would create new problems for me. I'd be a landlord to my own family, worried about late payments and property damage and having to evict my own son if you decided to stop paying rent. I'd lose my home and gain a business relationship with people who've already proven they don't think my feelings matter." That's not fair, Michael protested. We've apologized. We're trying to make it right. No, I said again. You're trying to find a way to get what you originally wanted while making me think it was my idea. You're trying to turn my boundary into your business opportunity. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment. Through the window, I could see Rosa in the courtyard tending to her small garden, her movements peaceful and purposeful. Here was a woman who'd lost her husband, just like me. Who'd had to rebuild her life from scratch, just like me. But who'd emerged from that rebuilding with her dignity intact, her boundaries clear, her relationships mutual and respectful. I wanted to be like Rosa. I wanted to move through the world with her calm confidence, her ability to give freely without being exploited, her capacity for love without doormat martyrdom. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called Harold's sister Margaret, who lived in Florida and whom I'd barely spoken to since the funeral. Harold and Margaret had been close, sharing the same quick wit and stubborn integrity that I'd fallen in love with decades ago. Edna. Margaret's voice was warm with surprise. How wonderful to hear from you. How are you holding up? I told her everything. The loans, the beach house, the stolen books, the social media posts, the rental offer. I told her about my fear of loneliness, my confusion about whether I was being reasonable, my grief for the family relationships I'd thought I had. Margaret listened without interrupting, making the small sounds of understanding that Harold used to make when I shared my worries with him. Honey, she said when I finished, Harold would be furious. He always said Michael was too soft, too willing to take the easy way instead of the right way. But he'd be proud of you for standing up for yourself. God knows it took you long enough. The last comment stung a little, but I recognized it as loving honesty rather than criticism. I feel like I'm losing my family, I told her. You're losing people who were using you, Margaret corrected. That's different from losing family. Harold's grandson who calls you on your birthday without being reminded, he's family. That neighbor who drives you to legal appointments and brings you soup when you're sick, she's family. People who love you because of who you are, not because of what you can provide for them, that's family. We talked for 2 hours, sharing memories of Harold, catching up on Margaret's life, making plans for me to visit her in Florida after the new year. When I hung up, I felt more connected to Harold's memory than I had in months, not through the martyrdom of protecting his possessions from people who didn't value them, but through the joy of sharing stories about him with someone who'd loved him as much as I did. The next day, I made a decision that 6 months ago would have terrified me. I changed my will. Jennifer helped me set up an appointment with an estate planning attorney, and together we restructured my assets in ways that reflected my real values rather than my fears. The beach house would go to a conservation trust that would preserve it as a natural sanctuary. My savings would be divided between Rosa's daughter's college fund and several charities that Harold and I had supported over the years. Michael and Susan would inherit some family jewelry and photographs, but the bulk of my estate would go to people and organizations that had shown respect for me while I was alive to appreciate it. How do you feel about this decision? The attorney asked as I signed the documents. Free, I said, and realized I meant it. That freedom was tested one more time, in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was Thanksgiving morning. I'd planned to spend the day quietly with Rosa, cooking together and watching the parade, maybe calling Margaret in the afternoon. A peaceful holiday that didn't require managing anyone else's expectations or navigating family landmines. But at 9 in the morning, Emma called me. Grandma, she said, her voice small and sad, why aren't you coming to Thanksgiving dinner? Daddy said you don't want to see us anymore. My heart cracked. This sweet child, caught in the middle of adult conflict she couldn't understand, believing that my boundary setting meant I didn't love her. Oh, sweetheart, I said, I love you and Joey more than you can possibly imagine. I will always want to see you. But sometimes adults need to work through problems before they can be together in healthy ways. Are you punished? She asked, and I almost smiled at her 8-year-old logic. No, honey, I'm not punished. Sometimes people treat each other badly, and when that happens, we need to take breaks to think about how to treat each other better. Will you come to Christmas? She asked. It was the question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to a child that her parents have made it impossible for you to attend family gatherings by turning every interaction into a battle about respect and boundaries? I don't know yet, I told her honestly. But I promise that whatever happens between me and your parents, it will never change how much I love you. After she hung up, I cried the kinds of tears that come from the deepest places of loss. Not just grief for Harold, but grief for the grandmother I'd thought I'd be, for the family traditions I'd imagined we'd create, for the simple joy of holidays spent with people who loved me genuinely. But underneath the grief was something new, the recognition that loving someone doesn't mean accepting mistreatment from them. That protecting my own well-being might be the most loving thing I could do for grandchildren who needed to learn that all people, including elderly women, deserve respect. That afternoon, Rosa and I cooked a small but perfect Thanksgiving dinner. We shared stories, watched football, and called our respective family members who treated us with kindness. It was quiet and peaceful and completely free of the tension that had characterized every family gathering for the past 3 years. Do you miss them? Rosa asked as we cleaned up the dishes. I miss who I thought they were, I said. I miss the family I imagined we'd be. But I don't miss the stress and hurt and confusion. I don't miss feeling invisible in my own life. That evening, I received a text message from Susan. Hope you're happy spending the holidays alone. The kids are confused and upset that their grandmother chose pride over family. I stared at that text for a long time, feeling the familiar guilt trying to creep back in. Had I chosen pride over family? Was I being selfish and stubborn? But then I remember something Jennifer had told me during one of our meetings. Mrs. Patterson, when someone accuses you of choosing pride over family, ask yourself, why is my dignity seen as incompatible with their love? Why can't they love me and respect me at the same time? I didn't respond to Susan's text. Instead, I called Margaret and told her about Emma's phone call, about the text message, about the way they were using the children's confusion as a weapon against my boundaries. They're doing exactly what abusers always do, Margaret said bluntly. They're making you responsible for the consequences of their own behavior. They're the ones who created this situation by lying and stealing and exploiting you. But they want you to be the one who fixes it by accepting their mistreatment. An abuser. Margaret had used that word deliberately, and it landed like a punch to my stomach. I'd never thought of my own family as abusers. Neglectful, maybe. Selfish and inconsiderate, certainly. But abusive seemed too harsh, too dramatic. But as I thought about the patterns of the past 3 years, the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the isolation from other family members, the using of my grandchildren as weapons against my self-respect, the word began to fit. They weren't hitting me or screaming at me, but they were systematically defeating my sense of self-worth, my right to make decisions about my own property, my expectation of basic respect. That was abuse, even if it wore the mask of family love. December passed quietly. I sent Christmas gifts to Emma and Joey through Margaret, not trusting that Michael and Susan wouldn't use my presence as opportunities for more manipulation. I spent Christmas Eve with Rosa and her extended family, welcomed as an honorary aunt by people who'd known me for less than 3 years but treated me with more genuine affection than I'd received from my own relatives in decades. On New Year's Eve, I made a resolution that would have shocked the woman I'd been 12 months earlier. I enrolled in a photography class. Harold had always encouraged me to pursue hobbies that weren't centered around caregiving and household management. You have such a good eye for beauty, he'd say when I'd point out interesting shadows or unusual cloud formations during our walks. You should do something with that. But there had never been time. Always someone who needed something, always a crisis to manage, always my own interests pushed to the bottom of the priority list. Now, suddenly, I had time. All the energy I'd been spending on managing other people's emotions and problems was available for my own interests. The silence in my apartment wasn't empty anymore, it was full of possibility. The photography teacher, a patient man in his 60s named David, encouraged us to start by capturing things that brought us joy. I found myself drawn to sunrise shots from my apartment's small balcony, the way the early light transformed the ordinary courtyard into something magical. I photographed Rosa's hands as she tended her plants, the texture of old brick walls, the expressions on strangers' faces as they hurried through Penn Station. For the first time in years, I was creating something rather than just maintaining things. I was learning instead of just teaching. I was exploring my own interests instead of accommodating everyone else's needs. You have a gift for finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, David told me after looking through my first portfolio. These photos tell stories. Stories. I'd spent so many years being a supporting character in other people's stories that I'd forgotten I could be the protagonist of my own. In February, Rosa convinced me to submit some of my photographs to a local gallery that featured work by seniors. To my amazement, 3 of my sunrise photographs were selected for their spring exhibition. The opening reception was small and casual, but seeing my work hanging on a gallery wall, seeing strangers stop to look at images I'd created, gave me a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt since I'd taught my grandchildren to swim. Margaret flew up from Florida for the exhibition opening. We spent a wonderful week together, visiting museums, trying new restaurants, sharing memories of Harold and making plans for future adventures. She insisted on buying prints of all my displayed photographs. Harold would be so proud, she said as we stood in front of my sunrise series. He always said you saw beauty in places other people overlooked. It was true. Even as a young woman, I'd been the one to notice wildflowers growing in vacant lots, to point out interesting architecture on buildings others ignored, to find meaning in small moments that more dramatic people missed. Harold had seen and valued that quality in me, but somehow I'd lost touch with it during the years of constant caregiving and crisis management. Photography was giving it back to me. Spring came early that year. By March, Rosa and I had established a routine of weekend photo walks around different New York neighborhoods. She'd bring her sketchpad, I'd bring my camera, and we'd spend hours exploring together, sometimes talking, sometimes comfortable in shared silence. It was during one of these walks, in a small park in Brooklyn, that I had an encounter that would test everything I'd learned about boundaries and self-respect. I was photographing the early cherry blossoms when I heard a familiar voice behind me, "Mom." I turned to see Joey, my 8-year-old grandson, running toward me with a huge smile. Behind him, more slowly, came Michael and Emma. My heart leaped and sank simultaneously. Joy at seeing the children warred with dread at the inevitable confrontation with Michael. But I'd learned enough about myself to know that avoiding difficult moments only gave other people power over my emotions and schedule. "Grandma." Joey launched himself into my arms with the unconscious affection that children give so freely. "I missed you. Why haven't you come to see us?" Emma was more cautious, hanging back and studying my face as if trying to read my mood. Always the more sensitive of the two, she'd picked up on the adult tensions in ways that Joey had not. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I told Joey, meaning it completely. "I think about you and your sister every day." Michael approached us with visible reluctance, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "Mom, you look good." I did look good. The months of reduced stress had improved my sleep, and the photography walks had given me more exercise than I'd gotten in years. Rosa had convinced me to update my wardrobe, and I was wearing a bright red coat that made me feel confident and visible. "Thank you," I said simply. An awkward silence stretched between us. The children sensed it immediately. Emma moved closer to me, while Joey began chattering about school and friends and the baseball season that was starting soon. "We miss you, Grandma," Emma said quietly. "It feels weird not having you at family stuff." The simplicity of a child's perspective cut through all the complexity I'd been wrestling with. They missed me. Not my money, not my services, not my convenient availability, they missed me. "I miss you too, Emma," I said. "Very much." Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we could talk. Just for a few minutes." Rosa materialized at my elbow, as if she'd sensed I might need support. Michael's eyes widened slightly as he recognized her, the woman who'd been present for several of our confrontations, who'd witnessed his treatment of me. "Hello, Michael," Rosa said pleasantly. "It's nice to see you again." Michael nodded awkwardly, then looked back at me. "Would you be okay with just walking with the kids for a few minutes? I know things have been complicated, but they really do miss their grandmother." It was manipulative, using the children's feelings as leverage. But it was also true. They did miss me, and I missed them desperately. "Of course," I said. "Rosa, would you like to join us?" Rosa's presence meant that Michael couldn't launch into the kind of emotional manipulation that had worked on me in the past. With a witness present, especially a witness who'd seen his previous behavior, he was forced to interact with me more respectfully. We walked slowly through the park, the children running ahead to explore while Michael and I made careful small talk. He asked about my photography, genuinely seeming interested in my answers. He mentioned that Susan had gotten a promotion at work, that they'd been able to catch up on some bills. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I didn't wish financial hardship on them. I just didn't want their problems to automatically become my responsibilities. As we neared the end of our walk, Michael stopped walking and looked at me directly for the first time in months. "Mom," he said, "I know I've made mistakes. We've handled a lot of things badly. But I want you to know that we all miss having you in our lives. The kids ask about you constantly." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd gotten from him, and I could see the effort it was costing him to admit fault. "I miss being in your lives," I replied honestly. "But I can't go back to the way things were before. I can't go back to being someone who's only valued for what I can provide." Michael nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. Susan and I have been talking, and we realize we probably took advantage of your generosity without thinking about how it felt from your perspective. Progress. Small, but genuine. "I love you, Michael," I said. "I love Susan and the children. But love has to include respect. It has to include honesty. It has to be mutual." Could we try to figure out what that looks like?" he asked. "Could we maybe start over and try to build something healthier?" I looked at my grandchildren, who were feeding ducks at the small pond, their laughter carrying across the water. I thought about all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments I'd already missed. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, and the woman I was becoming. "We can try," I said carefully. "But things will be different. I'll be different." Michael's expression was a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Different how?" "I won't automatically say yes to every request," I said. "I won't lend money without clear repayment plans. I won't have people stay in my house without my direct involvement in the planning. I won't accept being treated like my feelings don't matter. That sounds reasonable, Michael said, though his voice carried uncertainty. The question, I continued, is whether you and Susan can accept those boundaries. Whether you can love me as I am, not just as the person who makes your lives easier. It was a fair question, and Michael seemed to understand that. We exchanged phone numbers. Mine had changed when I'd established new bank accounts, and made tentative plans to have coffee later in the week. As we prepared to leave, Emma hugged me tightly. Will you come to my birthday party next month? She asked. We'll see, sweetheart, I said. Your dad and I are going to work on rebuilding our relationship, and we'll figure out celebrations as we go. Driving home with Rosa, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. Michael's approach had been different, more respectful, more authentic. But I'd been disappointed before, and I was determined to judge by actions rather than words. How do you feel? Rosa asked as we pulled into our building's parking garage. Hopeful, I said. But careful. Careful turned out to be wise. The coffee meeting the following week went well. Michael came alone, which I appreciated. It showed that he was taking responsibility for his own relationship with me rather than expecting Susan to manage his emotions. We talked honestly about the past year, about the hurt feelings on both sides, about what we each needed from a renewed relationship. I want you to know, Michael said, that we never meant to hurt you. We were focused on our problems and didn't think about how our solutions affected you. Impact matters more than intention, I replied, using a phrase Jennifer had taught me. The fact that you didn't mean to hurt me doesn't erase the hurt that was done. Michael accepted that point without argument, which felt like progress. We agreed to start slowly, planned visits, clear communication about expectations, mutual respect for each other's boundaries. It felt like the beginning of an adult relationship between equals rather than the parent-child dynamic that had persisted well past its appropriate expiration date. But 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that revealed how little had actually changed. Mom, Susan's voice was tight with familiar desperation, we have a situation. My mother fell and broke her hip. She can't go back to her apartment right away, and she needs somewhere to recover. We were wondering if she could stay at the beach house for a few weeks while she heals. There it was. The first test of our new boundaries, presented as a genuine family emergency that no reasonable person could refuse. I'm sorry to hear about your mother's accident, I said carefully. That must be very stressful for your family. So she can stay at the beach house? Susan pressed. Just until she's back on her feet? The old me would have said yes immediately, would have felt guilty for even hesitating to help someone in need. But I'd learned to recognize the pattern. The emergency that somehow required my resources, the assumption that my property was available for their crisis management, the emotional pressure disguised as a simple request. Susan, I understand you're in a difficult situation, I said. But the beach house isn't set up for someone recovering from surgery. There are stairs to navigate, no grab bars in the bathrooms, no nearby medical facilities. It's really not appropriate for your mother's needs. She doesn't need medical facilities, Susan said, her voice sharpening with frustration. She just needs a quiet place to rest. The beach house would be perfect. What about a rehabilitation facility? I asked. Or assisted living that offers short-term recovery services? Those would be much safer options for someone with mobility issues. Those cost money, Susan snapped. We can't afford those kinds of places. And there it was. The assumption that their financial limitations automatically created obligations for me. I understand that's difficult, I said. But it doesn't change the fact that my house isn't appropriate for your mother's medical needs. The argument that followed was depressingly familiar. Susan accused me of being heartless and selfish. She reminded me of all the times her family had supposedly helped me, though when pressed, she couldn't actually name any specific instances. She suggested that my refusal was motivated by lingering resentment rather than practical concerns. Michael got on the phone to try a different approach. Mom, we know you're still upset about last summer, and we understand that. But this is different. This is a real medical emergency, not us trying to take advantage. Michael, I said, if this is genuinely about your mother-in-law's medical needs, then you need medical solutions. If it's about needing a free place for her to stay, then you're asking me to solve your financial problem, not her medical problem. The distinction seemed to genuinely confuse them. In their minds, my property existed to solve their problems, whatever those problems might be. The idea that I might have criteria for how my house should be used, that I might prioritize appropriateness over availability, didn't compute. I ended the call by offering to help them research appropriate recovery facilities and to contribute financially to the extent that I could afford. But I held firm on the beach house. Within hours, I received a text from Emma. Grandma, why won't you help great-grandma get better? Daddy says you'd rather be mean than help family. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Using a child to deliver emotional blackmail, framing my reasonable boundary as meanness, presenting my offer to help research alternatives and contribute financially as a complete refusal to help at all. I didn't respond to Emma's text. Instead, I called Michael. "Don't ever use my grandchildren to manipulate me again," I said without preamble. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what I meant. "Emma just texted me to ask why I won't help her great-grandmother get better. 8-year-olds don't come up with that kind of language on their own." Silence. "If you can't discuss our disagreements directly with me, then you're not ready for an adult relationship," I continued. "And if you teach my grandchildren that emotional manipulation is how family members resolve conflicts, then you're damaging them as well as me." "Mom, you're overreacting. We were just explaining the situation to the kids. You were turning them into weapons against my boundaries," I corrected. "And it stops now, or our reconciliation stops now." I hung up the phone and immediately called Jennifer to document the incident. She assured me that using children as intermediaries in adult conflicts was a recognized form of emotional abuse, and that my response had been appropriate. But the damage to my hope was significant. I'd wanted to believe that Michael and Susan were capable of change, that the respectful interaction in the park represented genuine growth rather than temporary strategy. Instead, it seemed that their apology had been designed to restore access to my resources rather than to repair our relationship. That evening, Rosa found me sitting on my balcony staring at the city lights, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment and confusion. "What happened, Mija?" she asked gently. I told her about the phone calls, about Emma's text, about the realization that nothing had really changed except their tactics. "I feel like I'm going crazy," I said. "They make everything sound so reasonable when they're asking for it. It's only afterward that I realize how manipulative it was." Rosa was quiet for a long time, watching the traffic move through the streets below us. "You know what I think," she said finally. "I think you keep hoping they'll become the people you need them to be. But people show you who they are through their actions, not their words. And their actions keep showing you the same thing." She was right. I'd been so focused on the person Michael could be, the family we could have, that I'd ignored the person he actually was and the family we actually had. But accepting that truth didn't make it hurt less. The next morning brought vindication in an unexpected form. Margaret called me from Florida, laughing so hard she could barely speak. "Edna," she gasped, "you'll never believe what I just saw on Facebook." Apparently, Susan's sister had posted asking for donations to help with their mother's recovery expenses. The post made no mention of the multi-week beach house vacation she'd enjoyed at my expense just months earlier, no acknowledgement of the financial support their family had received from me over the years. Instead, it painted them as struggling young parents with no resources and no family support. "The audacity," Margaret said, "is almost impressive. They're crowdfunding money for a problem they could solve by selling some of those first edition books they tried to steal from you. Harold's books." I'd almost forgotten about that violation in the face of all the subsequent manipulation. But Margaret was right, they were asking strangers for money to solve a problem they could address by selling the valuable property they'd tried to appropriate from me. "It's like they exist in an alternate reality," I said. "No," Margaret corrected. "They exist in a reality where your needs don't count and your property doesn't belong to you. It's not an alternate reality, it's an abusive reality." That afternoon, I made a decision that represented the final letting go of my hopes for reconciliation. I blocked Michael and Susan's phone numbers. I blocked them on social media. I changed the locks on the beach house and installed a security system. I wrote a letter explaining my decision and sent it through a certified mail, creating a paper trail that documented my withdrawal of consent for them to use my property or contact me directly. The letter was simple and direct. I was no longer available for relationships that required me to accept disrespect, manipulation, and exploitation. If they decided they wanted a genuine relationship based on mutual respect, they could communicate that desire through my attorney. Until then, they were not welcome in my life or on my property. I also sent a separate letter to Emma and Joey, age-appropriate but honest, explaining that I loved them but needed to protect myself from their parents' behavior. I told them that when they were adults, I would welcome the opportunity to build relationships with them directly, but that for now, their parents had made it impossible for me to be part of their lives in healthy ways. It was the hardest letter ever written. I must have drafted it a dozen times, balancing honesty with kindness, clarity with gentleness. But those children deserved truth from at least one adult in their lives, even if that truth was painful. Both letters were delivered on a Friday. I spent the weekend with Rosa, visiting museums and trying new restaurants, keeping busy so I wouldn't obsess over Michael's potential response. The response, when it came the following Monday, was predictable and devastating. Michael left 17 voicemails, his tone evolving from confusion to anger to desperation as the day progressed. Susan sent a series of text messages that Rosa characterized as basically a manifesto of entitlement. Several relatives I barely knew called to tell me how disappointed they were in my selfishness. But the message that broke my heart came from Margaret later that week. "They called me," she said without preamble when I answered the phone. "Michael and Susan. They wanted me to talk sense into you, to convince you that you're being unreasonable." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth," Margaret replied. "That you've spent 3 years being taken advantage of, that Harold would be furious at their behavior, and that I'm proud of you for finally standing up for yourself." "And how did they respond?" "They accused me of poisoning your mind against them," Margaret said dryly. "Apparently, the idea that you might have independent thoughts and feelings is incomprehensible to them." But the worst revelation was still coming. Margaret's voice became gentler as she continued. "Edna, they told me things. They said things about you that made it clear how they've been talking about you privately. They called you paranoid, said your grief over Harold had made you unstable, suggested that your financial decisions were evidence of dementia." The words hit like physical blows. They'd been building a narrative about my mental health to justify their treatment of me, preparing grounds to challenge my competency if I continued to resist their demands. "They're creating a storyline where you're not a competent adult making reasonable boundary decisions," Margaret continued. "They're setting up a scenario where anyone who agrees with you must be manipulating you, and anyone who disagrees with them must be influenced by your mental illness." I felt sick. Not just hurt, but physically ill at the realization of how completely they'd pathologized my resistance to their exploitation. "Margaret," I said when I could trust my voice, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to document this conversation, everything they said about my mental state. And I need you to be prepared to testify to my competency if this goes legal." "Absolutely," Margaret said immediately. In fact, I already started taking notes during the call. Something about their approach felt predatory. That evening, I called Jennifer and arranged an emergency consultation. Within a week, she'd helped me establish documentation of my mental competency through medical evaluations and cognitive assessments. She also connected me with an elder law specialist who began preparing defenses against potential challenges to my financial decision-making. "What you're experiencing is called financial abuse," the elder law attorney explained. "Adult children who've become accustomed to exploiting elderly parents often escalate their tactics when the exploitation is challenged. Questioning your mental competency is a classic escalation." I'd been naive to think that setting boundaries would end the abuse. Instead, it had forced the abuse into the open, revealing its true extent and viciousness. But I'd also learned something important about myself. I was stronger than I'd believed. Every challenge to my decision had clarified rather than confused my thinking. Every attempt to manipulate me had strengthened rather than weakened my resolve. Over the following months, the attacks gradually subsided. Michael and Susan seemed to realize that I'd surrounded myself with legal and emotional support that made me difficult to exploit. The relatives who'd initially criticized my decision began to drift away, apparently too busy to maintain relationships that didn't offer them obvious benefits. But other relationships deepened and flourished. Rosa and I traveled to Florida to visit Margaret, and the three of us spent a wonderful week sharing stories, taking photographs, and enjoying each other's company. Margaret came north for my 73rd birthday, and Rosa organized a small party that included several friends from my photography class. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who celebrated my accomplishments rather than cataloging my usefulness. People who were interested in my thoughts and opinions rather than just my financial resources. People who respected my boundaries because they wanted relationships with me, not control over me. The spring photography exhibition was bigger than the year before, and this time I had several pieces selected. The opening reception drew a nice crowd, and I found myself talking easily with strangers about my work, my inspiration, the stories behind the images. One photograph in particular drew a lot of attention, a sunrise shot from my apartment balcony, but taken from a low angle that made the familiar courtyard look vast and full of possibility. I'd titled it, New Horizons, and people seemed to understand something about transformation and hope from looking at it. "This is remarkable," a woman about my age said as she studied the photograph. "There's so much promise in this image. It makes me think about starting over." "It's never too late to start over," I told her, and realized I completely believed it. As the evening wound down, Margaret raised her glass of champagne. "To Edna," she said, "who learned that it's never too late to stop being convenient and start being authentic." Rosa added, "To women who refuse to disappear." I raised my own glass. "To second chances and first priorities." That night, I drove out to the beach house alone for the first time since the confrontation with Michael. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in years, free from the tension of managing other people's expectations and needs. I sat on the deck watching the stars appear over Long Island Sound, thinking about Harold and how proud he would be of the woman I'd become. Not the martyred, self-sacrificing woman I'd been after his death, but someone who honored his memory by refusing to let others diminish my sense of self-worth. The house still held all our memories, but now it held new ones too, memories of standing up for myself, of choosing dignity over peace, of learning that love and respect could coexist. I thought about Emma and Joey, now 9 and 10 years old, growing up in a family that would teach them that elderly people exist to be exploited, that boundaries are selfish, that love means accepting mistreatment. Maybe someday they'd question those lessons. Maybe someday they'd seek me out and we'd build relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. Or maybe not. Maybe they'd absorb their parents' values and become adults who saw elderly relatives as resources to be managed. But that was their choice to make, and I couldn't sacrifice my well-being now for the possibility of relationships that might never materialize. What I could do was live as an example of what dignity looked like, show them that elderly women weren't disposable, weren't automatically available, weren't required to accept whatever scraps of affection were thrown their way. Have you ever reached that moment of understanding? When you realize that the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses? When you understand that accepting mistreatment doesn't help anyone, including the people inflicting it? As I sat on that deck, I felt Harold's presence not in the possessions he'd left behind, but in the values he'd instilled in me. Respect for myself and others. Honesty in all relationships. The understanding that love without respect is just manipulation wearing a prettier mask. The stars grew brighter as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Somewhere in the city, Michael and Susan were probably complaining about my unreasonableness to anyone who would listen. Somewhere, Emma and Joey were growing up with a distorted understanding of family relationships. But here, in this moment, I was exactly where I belonged. Free from exploitation, surrounded by beauty, planning my next photography project and my next visit with Margaret. Living as the woman Harold had fallen in love with 47 years ago, the woman who'd gotten lost in grief and manipulation but who'd found her way back to herself. I stayed at the beach house that night, falling asleep to the sound of waves and waking early to photograph the sunrise that had become my signature subject. The light that morning was particularly beautiful, painting the sound in shades of gold and pink that made the familiar scene look freshly created. As I framed the shot, I thought about how many sunrises I'd witnessed from this spot, how many mornings I'd started by documenting beauty rather than managing crisis. Photography had taught me to look for light in the darkness, to find composition in chaos, to appreciate the present moment instead of constantly worrying about future problems. The photo I took that morning would later become one of my most requested pieces. People said it conveyed hope and peace in ways that spoke to their own desires for transformation. But in that moment, I was just a woman with a camera, grateful to be alive and free and surrounded by beauty. Months later, as autumn painted the trees around our apartment building in shades of gold and crimson, Rosa and I were enjoying our weekly coffee on my balcony when she asked the question that had been hanging in the air between us. Do you regret it, Mija? Any of it? I considered her question seriously, as I always did with Rosa's gentle inquiries. Did I regret losing relationships with my son and daughter-in-law? Did I regret the pain of watching my grandchildren grow up without me? Did I regret the loneliness that sometimes still hit me late at night? I regret that it was necessary, I said finally. I regret that they made it necessary. I regret the family we never became, the grandmother I never got to be. But, Rosa prompted gently. But I don't regret choosing myself, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. I don't regret insisting on respect. I don't regret refusing to disappear into their convenient version of what an elderly mother should be. Rosa nodded with satisfaction. Good. Because you know what I think? I think you saved yourself. And maybe, someday, you saved them too. Maybe someday they'll understand that relationships built on exploitation aren't sustainable, that love without respect always collapses eventually. Maybe, I agreed. But even if they never learn that, I learned it. And that has to be enough. That evening, as I prepared dinner for myself, something I'd learned to enjoy rather than just endure, I reflected on all the ways my life had changed. My apartment was arranged to please me rather than accommodate visitors. My schedule included activities I enjoyed rather than obligations I'd accepted. My bank account was mine to manage rather than mine to share. But the most profound change was internal. I no longer spent my days vigilant for the next crisis that would require my resources, no longer lay awake at night wondering if I was good enough, generous enough, necessary enough to deserve love. I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by my usefulness to others, that my love wasn't conditional on other people's appreciation. I'd become the protagonist of my own life instead of a supporting character in everyone else's drama. As I finish sharing this story with you, I want you to know that I'm not the same woman who stood on that creaky porch 2 years ago, watching strangers treat my sanctuary like a hotel. That woman was drowning in a sea of obligation and exploitation, gasping for air in relationships that had long since stopped nurturing her. The woman I am today breathes freely. She takes photographs that capture beauty and hope. She travels with friends who value her company. She makes decisions based on what's right for her rather than what's convenient for others. She's learned that saying no to disrespect is saying yes to dignity. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, if you've recognized yourself in the woman who always says yes, who always gives more than she receives, who always puts everyone else's needs before her own, I want you to know something. You deserve better. You deserve relationships where you're valued for who you are, not just what you can provide. You deserve to have your boundaries respected, your feelings acknowledged, your needs considered. You deserve love that doesn't require you to disappear in order to accommodate it. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to insist on respect. Have you lived something like this? Do you know someone who's trapped in relationships that exploit their kindness and generosity? Tell me in the comments below. Share your story, your struggles, your victories. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is break the silence around elder abuse and family manipulation. And if this story resonated with you, if it helped you feel less alone or gave you courage to examine your own boundaries, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but necessary truths, and it helps these stories reach other people who might need to hear them. Remember, choosing dignity over convenience isn't selfish. It's survival. And survival is always worth fighting for.